Detective Sarah Chen had always been told she lived too much in her head. At 32, with 8 years on the Chicago PD and a clearance rate that made seasoned veterans jealous, she still heard her mother's voice every time she walked into a family gathering. "Sarah's got another one of her conspiracy theories," her mother would announce to the room, rolling her eyes as if discussing a child's imaginary friend. "She thinks everyone's connected to everyone else, like some kind of detective show nonsense." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her father, Dr. Marcus Chen, a respected cardiologist who measured success in published papers and surgical precision, would nod along with practiced disappointment. "Pattern recognition without evidence is just paranoia, sweetheart. You need to learn the difference between correlation and causation." They'd shared these observations freely at dinner tables, holiday gatherings, and family barbecues, always with Sarah sitting right there, listening to them dissect her career like a failed experiment. But Sarah had learned something her parents never understood about police work. Sometimes the dots connected themselves, even when the lines seemed impossible to draw. Sometimes the cases that looked random weren't random at all. And sometimes, when you'd spent years documenting those connections in detailed reports that got filed away and forgotten, someone finally noticed the pattern you'd been tracking all along. The first case that really opened Sarah's eyes had been a jewelry store robbery in Chinatown 3 years ago. Nothing spectacular about it, just another smash and grab that netted maybe $15,000 in merchandise. But something about the security footage had bothered her. The way the perpetrator moved, the specific tools he'd used, the 47 seconds he spent inside the store. It reminded her of something she'd seen before in a case file from Detroit that had crossed her desk during a multi-jurisdictional briefing 6 months earlier. She'd stayed after her shift that night, pulling files and cross-referencing details that her training sergeant would have called irrelevant. The Detroit case had the same timing, same entry method, same type of merchandise targeted. When she dug deeper, she found a similar case in Milwaukee, then another in Cleveland. 4 cities, 4 jewelry stores, all within a 6-month window. The perpetrators looked different in each security video, but the methodology was identical down to the second. Sarah had written up her findings in a detailed memo, complete with timeline analysis and geographical mapping. She'd submitted it to her lieutenant with a recommendation for federal involvement, suggesting they were looking at an organized crew rather than isolated incidents. The response had been swift and deflating. "Good police work, Chen, but we solved Chicago crimes, not national conspiracies. Focus on your caseload." When she'd mentioned it on Sunday dinner, her parents' reaction had been even less encouraging. "You're connecting dots that aren't there, honey," her mother had said, cutting into her pot roast with surgical precision. "4 robberies in 4 cities doesn't mean anything. Criminals watch the news too. They copy what works." Her father had nodded sagely. "Occam's razor, Sarah. The simplest explanation is usually correct. These are just copycat crimes." Professional efficiency, always in different cities, with perpetrators who looked nothing alike but moved with identical purpose. Sarah had mapped it all, documented the evolution of the pattern, tracked the geographical spread that seemed to follow major highways and transport hubs. Her parents' mockery had intensified as her conviction grew stronger. "Sarah's got her conspiracy board again," her mother would announce when relatives visited. "She thinks there's some kind of master criminal running operations across the Midwest, like something out of a movie." They'd invited her to explain her theory to Uncle Robert, a retired insurance investigator, who'd listened politely before shaking his head. "Sweetheart, I've seen this before. Young investigators see patterns everywhere because they want to be the one who cracks the big case. It's normal, but it's not reality." The breaking point had come 8 months ago, during her nephew's birthday party. Sarah had been showing her cousin David, a forensic accountant, some of the financial patterns she'd identified in the cities where the crimes had occurred. Unusual cash deposits, money transfers that seemed to spike in the weeks following each incident, banking activity that suggested coordination rather than random crime. David had been genuinely interested, asking detailed questions about the data she'd compiled. Her mother had interrupted them mid-conversation, her voice carrying across the backyard loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sarah, stop bothering David with your fantasy detective work. He's got real cases to worry about." The words had stung more than usual, maybe because David's questions had made her feel like someone finally understood what she was seeing, or maybe because she'd started to doubt herself after 2 years of official indifference. That night, Sarah had gone home and stared at her laptop screen for 3 hours, looking at the map she'd built, showing 47 connected crimes across 11 states, wondering if her parents were right. Maybe she was just a beat cop with delusions of grandeur. Maybe the patterns she'd been tracking were just coincidences dressed up in careful analysis. Maybe it was time to focus on what her lieutenant called real police work and stop chasing shadows across state lines. But the next morning had brought news that changed everything. An art gallery heist in Milwaukee had gone wrong, leaving one perpetrator dead and another in custody. The survivor had started talking, providing details that matched Sarah's analysis so precisely that the arresting officers had contacted Chicago PD looking for the detective who'd predicted the connection 18 months earlier. Sarah's lieutenant had called her into his office with an expression she'd never seen before, somewhere between confusion and grudging respect. "Chen, I owe you an apology," he'd said, sliding a federal task force invitation across his desk. "Apparently, your conspiracy theory just became a federal investigation. They want you in Washington next week." The letter bore the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and a request for Detective Sarah Chen to provide briefing materials on what they termed Operation Spiderweb, a multi-state organized crime investigation that had been running parallel to her unofficial research for the past 18 months. Sarah had read the letter 3 times before the reality sunk in. The FBI had been tracking the same pattern she'd identified, but from the financial side rather than the methodology side. Her detailed documentation of the criminal techniques had filled gaps in their investigation that had been stalling their progress for months. They weren't asking her to consult on the case, they were asking her to help lead it. The call to her parents had been one of the most satisfying conversations of her adult life. "Mom, I need to take some vacation time next week," she'd said, keeping her voice casual. "I'm flying to Washington to brief the FBI on a case I've been working." The silence on the other end had stretched long enough for Sarah to wonder if the connection had dropped. When her mother finally
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
When she spoke, her voice had lost its usual dismissive tone. "The FBI wants to talk to you about one of your cases?" she'd asked, and Sarah could hear the confusion creeping in. "Which case?" Sarah had smiled, looking at the wall map in her apartment covered with pins and string connecting the dots her parents had insisted weren't there. "The conspiracy theory you've been making fun of for 2 years, Mom. Turns out it's real." The Washington briefing had been everything Sarah had hoped for and more. The federal task force had been impressed not just by her analysis, but by the meticulous documentation she'd maintained despite having no official support for the investigation. Agent Maria Rodriguez, the task force leader, had reviewed Sarah's files with the kind of attention to detail that Sarah's parents had always claimed her work lacked. "This is exceptional police work, Detective Chen," Rodriguez had said, spreading Sarah's geographical analysis across the conference table. "You've identified connections we missed and documented patterns our computer algorithms couldn't detect. We'd like you to consider a temporary assignment to the task force." The offer had been more than Sarah had dared to hope for. 6 months in Washington, working federal cases, with the possibility of permanent transfer if the assignment went well. Sarah had accepted immediately, then spent the flight back to Chicago composing the conversation she'd have with her parents. She'd imagined their surprise, their grudging admission that maybe her fantasy detective work had been more substantial than they'd realized. She'd pictured her father nodding with something approaching pride. Her mother finally understanding that the patterns Sarah saw weren't delusions, but genuine investigative insight. The reality had been more complicated. Her parents had been pleased about the federal opportunity, but they'd framed it as validation of their own advice rather than recognition of Sarah's capabilities.
See, her mother had said over dinner, all those years of telling you to focus on real police work finally paid off. The FBI recognized your potential. Her father had agreed enthusiastically. They saw past the conspiracy theories to your actual skills as an investigator. Good for you for not getting too caught up in that pattern-chasing nonsense. Sarah had tried to explain that the FBI had specifically recruited her because of the pattern analysis they'd dismissed, but her parents had already constructed their own narrative. In their version, the FBI had rescued Sarah from her own misguided instincts and put her on the right investigative track. They'd turned her success into proof of their own wisdom, transforming her vindication into their victory. The Washington assignment had exceeded every expectation Sarah had set for herself. Working with federal resources and access to databases she'd only dreamed of, she'd been able to expand her analysis far beyond what she'd accomplished working alone in Chicago. The organized crime ring she'd identified had turned out to be even more sophisticated than she'd suspected, with connections reaching into 12 states and involving coordination between multiple criminal enterprises. Her role on the task force had evolved from consultant to primary analyst, then to field operations coordinator, as her understanding of the criminal network had proven invaluable for predicting their next moves. Agent Rodriguez had become both mentor and advocate, pushing Sarah to pursue advanced training in financial crimes investigation and recommending her for specialized assignments that stretched her capabilities in the best possible way.
Had led to simultaneous raids in 7 cities, resulting in 34 arrests and the seizure of over $12 million in assets. The case had made national news, with Sarah's analytical work specifically credited in the Department of Justice press release. Her parents had called that night, their voices carrying pride and excitement she hadn't heard since her graduation from the police academy. "We saw you on the news," her mother had said, and for once, there was no hint of condescension in her tone. "They said you were the one who figured out how the whole thing worked." Her father had added his congratulations, admitting that he'd never understood the scope of what Sarah had been investigating. "I owe you an apology, sweetheart. Your pattern recognition wasn't paranoia. It was detective work at a level I didn't realize was possible." The apology had meant more to Sarah than the federal commendation or the media attention. For the first time in her adult life, her parents were seeing her work the way she'd always hoped they would, not as fantasy or delusion, but as legitimate law enforcement achievement. The validation had been worth years of family dinners filled with eye rolls and dismissive comments about her conspiracy theories. But the real test had come 2 weeks later, when Agent Rodriguez had called Sarah into her office with an expression that mixed excitement with something that looked like concern. "I've got an opportunity for you, Chen, but it's gonna sound crazy at first," she'd begun, closing her office door and activating a white noise generator that Sarah had learned meant classified conversation. "How would you feel about going back to Chicago, but not as Chicago PD?" The offer had been stunning in its implications. The FBI wanted Sarah to return to Chicago as an embedded federal agent, maintaining her cover as a local detective while actually running intelligence operations for a new task force focused on organized crime with international connections. It was undercover work at the highest level, requiring her to deceive not just criminals, but her own colleagues and family about the true nature of her assignment. "Your parents will think you washed out of the federal program and came home with your tail between your legs," Rodriguez had warned. "Your Chicago colleagues will think you couldn't cut it in Washington and got sent back to basic detective work. Everyone will underestimate you, which is exactly what we need for this operation to succeed." Sarah had understood immediately why the assignment appealed to her despite its challenges. After years of being underestimated by the people who should have known her best, she'd learned how to use other people's low expectations as camouflage for her real capabilities. The decision had required 2 weeks of consideration and consultation with FBI psychologists who'd evaluated her suitability for long-term undercover work. The psychological profile had been comprehensive, examining not just her mental stability, but her ability to maintain complex deceptions while remaining emotionally grounded in relationships with family and friends who wouldn't know her true role. Sarah had passed the evaluation with recommendations that surprised even the examining psychologists. Her years of dealing with her parents' dismissive attitudes had actually prepared her for the emotional challenges of undercover work. She'd already learned to compartmentalize her professional identity from her family relationships, maintaining her investigative focus despite constant undermining of her capabilities and judgment. The training had been intensive, covering everything from covert communication techniques to financial crimes investigation to international law enforcement cooperation. Sarah had spent 6 weeks at the FBI Academy, working with instructors who'd run similar operations in other major cities. The complexity of her assignment had required specialized preparation that went far beyond anything she had experienced in local law enforcement. When she'd finally returned to Chicago, the cover story had been perfect in its calculated humiliation. As far as anyone knew, Detective Sarah Chen had lasted 5 months in Washington before being sent home for incompatibility with federal procedures. Her lieutenant had welcomed her back with barely concealed satisfaction, suggesting that her brief federal assignment had taught her the value of focusing on local police work rather than chasing patterns across multiple jurisdictions. Her parents had been sympathetic but unsurprised by her apparent federal failure. Federal work is very different from local policing, her father had explained over dinner. It's more political, less focused on actual investigation. You're probably better off back where you can do real detective work. Her mother had agreed, suggesting that Sarah's pattern recognition instincts were better suited to local cases where she could see the complete picture rather than just pieces of larger investigations. Sarah had accepted their consolation with appropriate disappointment, internally marveling at how perfectly their assumptions aligned with the cover story the FBI had constructed. Everyone who thought they knew her had accepted the narrative that federal law enforcement had been too sophisticated for her capabilities, never suspecting that she'd actually been recruited for an assignment that required more advanced skills than anything she'd demonstrated during her Washington briefing. The real work had begun immediately upon her return to Chicago. Operating under the cover of routine detective duties, Sarah had actually been building a comprehensive intelligence network focused on tracking international organized crime operations, using Chicago as a hub for financial laundering and logistics coordination. Her official caseload provided perfect cover for the investigation, allowing her to pursue leads and develop sources without attracting attention from colleagues or criminals who might compromise her true mission. The irony hadn't been lost on Sarah that her parents' years of dismissing her analytical capabilities had actually prepared her perfectly for work that required maintaining false appearances while pursuing complex investigations. Every family dinner where they'd mocked her conspiracy theories had been practice for the much more sophisticated deceptions she now needed to maintain as part of her federal assignment. 3 months into the undercover operation, Sarah had identified connections between Chicago-based financial institutions and international criminal enterprises that surpassed anything the FBI had suspected when they designed her assignment. Her ability to recognize patterns that others dismissed as coincidence had proven even more valuable in the international context, where the connections between seemingly unrelated activities often spanned continents and required analysis techniques that traditional law enforcement approaches couldn't provide. The case she'd built had been methodical and comprehensive, documented with the same attention to detail that had characterized her unauthorized investigation of the jewelry store robberies years earlier. But this time, instead of filing reports that would be dismissed by supervisors who didn't understand the implications, she'd been reporting to federal handlers who not only appreciated the complexity of her analysis, but had been providing resources and support that allowed her to pursue leads wherever they led. Working undercover had required Sarah to become an expert at managing the emotional complexity of living multiple identities simultaneously. During the day, she'd been Detective Chen of the Chicago PD, investigating routine crimes and maintaining relationships with colleagues who had no idea of her true assignment. In the evenings, she'd been Federal Agent Chen, analyzing international financial transactions and coordinating with law enforcement agencies in 6 different countries. The most challenging aspect hadn't been the technical complexity of the investigation, but the personal isolation that came with being unable to share her real work with anyone in her immediate social circle.
Parents continued to view her as a local detective whose federal ambitions had been crushed by institutional reality. Her Chicago colleagues saw her as someone who'd failed to make the transition to federal work and had returned to routine local investigations. Only her FBI handlers understood the true scope and importance of what she was accomplishing. The breakthrough that would change everything had come during what appeared to be a routine fraud investigation involving a Chicago import business. Sarah's analysis of the company's financial records had revealed connections to shell corporations in 7 countries, all linked to the international criminal network she'd been tracking for months. The evidence she'd gathered had been sufficient not just for local prosecution, but for coordinated international law enforcement action that would dismantle criminal operations across multiple continents. But presenting that evidence would require revealing the true nature of her assignment, ending her undercover status, and exposing the federal investigation that had been using her Chicago position as cover. The decision about when and how to break her cover had been under discussion with FBI leadership for weeks, with considerations that went far beyond the immediate criminal case to include ongoing investigations that might be compromised by premature disclosure of federal involvement. The call that would resolve all those considerations had come on a Tuesday morning that started like any other day in Sarah's carefully constructed double life. She'd been reviewing case files at her Chicago PD desk, maintaining the appearance of routine detective work while actually analyzing financial data for her federal handlers, when her lieutenant had appeared with an expression she'd never seen before. "Chen, there's a call for you," he'd said, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and something that might have been respect. "It's from Washington. They want to talk to you about a case." Sarah had taken the call expecting routine coordination with her FBI handlers, but the voice on the other end had been unfamiliar and carried the kind of authority that made even federal agents stand at attention. "Detective Chen, this is Director Hamilton of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand you've been working on some interesting cases lately. I'd like you to come to Washington immediately. We have a situation that requires your specific expertise." The FBI director's personal involvement had meant that Sarah's undercover assignment was over, but it also meant that her work had attracted attention at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Director Hamilton's request hadn't been a routine consultation, but a direct recruitment for an assignment that would test every skill she'd developed during her years of being underestimated and dismissed by people who thought they understood the limits of her capabilities. The flight to Washington had given Sarah time to consider how dramatically her life was about to change. In a matter of hours, she would go from being seen as a local detective with failed federal ambitions to being publicly recognized as a federal agent whose analytical capabilities had earned the personal attention of the FBI director. The transformation would vindicate everything she'd believed about her own abilities, while simultaneously proving wrong everyone who dismissed her work as conspiracy theories and pattern-chasing nonsense. But the real satisfaction wouldn't come from professional recognition or career advancement. It would come from finally being able to tell her parents the truth about the work she'd been doing and the recognition it had earned. After years of family dinners filled with gentle mockery and well-intentioned advice about focusing on real police work, she would finally be able to explain that her pattern recognition hadn't been delusion, but advanced investigative technique that had attracted the attention of the nation's top law enforcement officials. The meeting with Director Hamilton had exceeded even Sarah's elevated
expectations. The case he'd outlined had been international in scope, involving criminal networks that spanned multiple continents and required analytical capabilities that few law enforcement personnel possessed. Sarah's work in Chicago had been preliminary research for an investigation that would test the limits of her pattern recognition abilities and require her to coordinate with intelligence agencies from dozens of countries. "Agent Chen," Director Hamilton had said, using her federal title for the first time in front of witnesses, "your analytical work has been extraordinary. We're offering you a permanent position as Senior Intelligence Analyst with immediate assignment to Operation Global Web. This investigation will require everything you've learned about recognizing patterns others miss and documenting connections others dismiss." The offer had represented not just career advancement, but professional vindication at the highest possible level. Sarah had accepted immediately, understanding that the assignment would require her to relocate to Washington permanently and take on responsibilities that would test every skill she'd developed during her years of independent investigation. But she'd also understood that this was the opportunity she'd been preparing for without knowing it.
the chance to use her pattern recognition abilities on cases where the stakes were measured not in local crime statistics, but in international security and economic stability. The hardest part of accepting the assignment had been imagining the conversation she would have with her parents. For years, they'd been gently encouraging her to abandon what they saw as unrealistic ambitions and focus on achievable goals within local law enforcement. Now she would have to explain that those unrealistic ambitions had actually been preparation for work at a level they'd never imagined possible. The call home had been one of the most satisfying moments of Sarah's professional life. "Mom, I need to tell you something about my job," she'd begun, keeping her voice steady despite the excitement building in her chest. "Remember those conspiracy theories you've been making fun of for the past few years? The pattern recognition you said was just paranoia?" The silence on the other end had been complete, and Sarah had been able to hear her own heartbeat while she waited for her mother's response. "What about them, honey?" her mother had finally asked, her voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty Sarah had heard in years of conversations about her career choices. "The FBI director just offered me a permanent position in Washington based on exactly that kind of analysis," Sarah had continued. "Turns out pattern recognition isn't paranoia when the patterns are real, and mine are very, very real." The conversation that followed had been everything Sarah had hoped for and more. Her parents had listened with growing amazement as she'd explained the true nature of her work over the past year, the federal assignment they thought was a failure, and the recognition her analytical capabilities had earned at the highest levels of law enforcement. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah had seen her parents struggle to understand capabilities they'd consistently underestimated, forced to reconsider assumptions they'd held about her work for years. "You mean the FBI has been using you as an undercover agent this whole time?" her father had asked, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and bewilderment that Sarah had never heard before. "And we thought you'd failed at federal work and come home disappointed?" Sarah had confirmed both points, explaining that their dismissive attitude toward her analytical work had actually provided perfect cover for an investigation that required maintaining false appearances while pursuing complex criminal connections. Her mother's response had been even more gratifying. "Sarah, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion that years of family dinners had never revealed. "We've been mocking work that was so sophisticated we couldn't even
Understand what you were doing. I'm so sorry we didn't see how capable you really are." The apology had meant more to Sarah than the federal recognition, representing acknowledgement from the people whose opinion mattered most, despite years of frustration with their inability to understand her work. The weeks that followed had been a whirlwind of preparation for her new assignment. Advanced training in international intelligence analysis, and coordination with law enforcement agencies whose existence she'd only recently learned about. Sarah's Chicago colleagues had been stunned to learn that their returned colleague had actually been working undercover for the FBI, transforming their perception of her from failed federal candidate to accomplished intelligence operative whose capabilities they'd never suspected. The transformation in her parents' attitude had been complete and deeply satisfying. Instead of gentle mockery about conspiracy theories, family conversations had become requests for stories about her federal work and expressions of pride in achievements they were finally beginning to understand. Her father had admitted that his advice about focusing on real police work had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of what Sarah's analytical capabilities could accomplish in the right environment. "You were never chasing patterns that weren't there," he'd told her during their last dinner before her permanent move to Washington. "You were seeing connections the rest of us weren't sophisticated enough to recognize. I'm sorry it took federal recognition for me to understand how remarkable your work really is." The acknowledgement had provided closure for years of frustration, while also validating Sarah's decision to pursue investigations that others had dismissed as unrealistic or delusional. The move to Washington had represented more than just career advancement. It had been the culmination of years of preparation and vindication of analytical capabilities that had been consistently underestimated by people who should have recognized their value.
Sarah's new assignment would test those capabilities at the highest possible level, while also providing the professional environment and resource access she'd needed to achieve her full potential as an investigative analyst. Standing in her new office, overlooking the Potomac, surrounded by case files that represented criminal investigations spanning 6 continents, Sarah had reflected on the journey that had brought her from Chicago beat cop to federal intelligence analyst. The path had been longer and more complicated than she'd expected, filled with detours through family skepticism and professional dismissal that had tested her confidence in her own abilities. But those challenges had also prepared her for work that required maintaining complex analysis while dealing with skepticism and resistance from people who didn't understand the implications of what she was investigating. Years of family dinners where her parents had gently mocked her conspiracy theories had been training for federal assignments where her pattern recognition would be the key to investigations that traditional law enforcement approaches couldn't penetrate. The first case Director Hamilton had assigned to her new position had been everything Sarah had hoped for and more. International criminal networks with connections so complex that previous analysts had been unable to map their structure. Financial transactions that spanned multiple currencies and dozens of shell corporations, and operational patterns that required exactly the kind of analytical capabilities Sarah had been developing throughout her law enforcement career. Working with resources and support that dwarfed anything she'd experienced in Chicago, Sarah had been able to pursue her analysis without the constraints that had limited her unofficial investigations. Access to international databases, cooperation with intelligence agencies from allied countries, and analytical software that could process connections across vast amounts of data had transformed her pattern recognition from
Individual insight into systematic investigative methodology. The results had been extraordinary. Within her first month in the new position, Sarah had identified connections that had eluded federal investigation for over 2 years, mapping criminal networks whose sophistication had previously made them invisible to traditional law enforcement approaches. Her analytical work had led to coordinated international operations that had disrupted criminal enterprises across multiple continents, validating the FBI director's decision to recruit her for the assignment. But the professional success had been matched by personal satisfaction that went beyond career advancement. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was working in an environment where her analytical capabilities were not just recognized, but actively sought after and supported with resources that allowed her to achieve results she'd only dreamed of during her years of independent investigation in Chicago. The phone call from her parents congratulating her on the international press coverage of her first major case had been the final piece of vindication Sarah had been seeking throughout her law enforcement career. "We saw the news about the international arrests," her mother had said, her voice carrying pride that years of family conversations had never revealed. "They said your analysis made the whole operation possible. We're so proud of what you've accomplished." Her father had been even more direct in his acknowledgement of how wrong their previous assessments had been. "Sarah, I owe you more than an apology," he'd said. "I owe you recognition that your analytical capabilities are at a level I never understood was possible. The patterns you were seeing weren't conspiracy theories. They were intelligence analysis that was beyond anything the rest of us could comprehend." The acknowledgement had provided closure for years of frustration while also validating Sarah's persistence in pursuing investigations that others had dismissed. Her pattern recognition hadn't been delusion or paranoia, but advanced analytical capability that had required the right environment and resources to demonstrate its full potential. The FBI had provided that environment, transforming individual insight into systematic investigative methodology that could tackle criminal enterprises at the highest levels of sophistication. Looking back on the journey that had brought her from Chicago detective to federal intelligence analyst, Sarah understood that every challenge she'd faced had been preparation for work that tested all of her capabilities while providing the professional recognition she'd been seeking throughout her law enforcement career. The years of family skepticism and institutional dismissal had taught her to maintain confidence in her analytical abilities despite external resistance, a skill that proved invaluable when investigating criminal networks whose sophistication made them invisible to conventional approaches.
The work ahead promised to be the most challenging and rewarding of her career, involving investigations that would test the limits of her pattern recognition abilities while contributing to international law enforcement efforts at the highest levels. Sarah's analytical capabilities had finally found their proper context, supported by resources and recognition that allowed her to achieve results that vindicated years of persistence in the face of skepticism and dismissal. The transformation from local detective whose work was dismissed as conspiracy theories to federal intelligence analyst whose capabilities attracted the personal attention of the FBI director represented more than just career advancement. It was vindication of the analytical approach Sarah had been developing throughout her law enforcement career, proof that pattern recognition dismissed by others as delusion could be systematic investigative methodology when properly understood and supported. Her parents' journey from gentle mockery to proud recognition paralleled the broader professional transformation that had taken Sarah from Chicago beat cop,
Federal intelligence analyst? The patterns she'd been tracking hadn't been conspiracy theories, but genuine criminal connections that required advanced analytical capabilities to identify and document. The FBI's recognition of those capabilities had provided the professional environment where Sarah's potential could be fully realized, transforming individual insight into systematic investigative approach that could tackle criminal enterprises at the international level. Sarah's first week in Washington had been a careful dance of classified briefings and security clearance upgrades, but nothing had prepared her for the Monday morning when Director Hamilton's assistant had called her into an emergency session that would test every analytical skill she'd developed over 8 years of law enforcement. The case file waiting on the conference table had been thicker than anything she'd encountered during her Chicago years, labeled with security classifications that made her federal clearance feel suddenly inadequate for what lay ahead. Agent Rodriguez had been waiting in the briefing room along with 3 analysts Sarah didn't recognize, their expressions carrying the kind of tension that suggested sleepless nights and cases that defied conventional investigation approaches. The wall displays showed financial transaction maps spanning continents, communication intercepts in languages Sarah couldn't identify, and surveillance photographs of individuals whose faces suggested they operated in worlds far removed from the street-level crime she'd been tracking in Chicago. Agent Chen, we've got a situation developing that requires your specific analytical capabilities, Rodriguez had begun, activating the room's secure communication protocols with practiced efficiency. What started as a routine money laundering investigation has evolved into something that threatens national security on multiple levels. We need someone who can see patterns others miss, and we need those insights immediately. The urgency in her voice had been unmistakable, suggesting that whatever Sarah was about to learn had implications far beyond routine federal investigation. The briefing had unfolded like a masterclass in international criminal sophistication. The initial investigation had focused on suspicious financial transactions flowing through Chicago-based institutions, patterns that had triggered automated alerts in the federal banking surveillance system. But deeper analysis had revealed connections to criminal enterprises operating across 6 continents, with coordination so sophisticated that traditional investigative approaches had been unable to penetrate their operational structure. The money flows we've identified represent just the surface layer, one of the analysts had explained, pulling up transaction records that showed millions of dollars moving through shell corporations with clockwork precision. Every time we think we've mapped their network, we discover another layer of complexity that suggests operational coordination at a level we've never encountered before. The financial data had been staggering in its scope, representing criminal enterprises whose sophistication dwarfed anything Sarah had investigated during her years of tracking organized crime patterns in the Midwest. But the financial investigation had been complicated by intelligence reports suggesting that the money laundering operation was funding activities that went far beyond traditional organized crime. Intercepted communications had referenced operations that sounded more like espionage than criminal enterprise, with discussions of asset placement and infrastructure compromise that suggested objectives measured in national security rather than mere profit. The federal task force had been struggling to understand whether they were investigating criminal activity or something that required coordination with intelligence agencies whose existence was itself classified. Sarah's role had been to analyze the complete intelligence picture and identify patterns that might reveal the true scope and objectives of what they were tracking.
Recognition capabilities had attracted federal attention precisely because conventional analytical approaches had failed to penetrate the operational sophistication of whatever they were investigating.
The case required someone who could see connections others missed and document those connections with sufficient precision to support actions that might affect international relations and national security. The analytical challenge had been unlike anything Sarah had encountered during her years of tracking organized crime in Chicago. The data sets had been enormous, spanning financial transactions, communication intercepts, surveillance reports, and intelligence assessments from allied countries whose cooperation had been essential for understanding the international scope of the investigation. Traditional analytical software had been unable to process the complexity of the connections, requiring Sarah to develop new approaches that combined automated analysis with intuitive pattern recognition. Working 18-hour days, with access to classified databases she'd never known existed, Sarah had begun mapping a criminal network whose sophistication and scope had exceeded every assumption the federal task force had made about what they were investigating. The financial transactions had been just one component of an operation that appeared to involve systematic infiltration of critical infrastructure, strategic placement of assets within key industries, and coordination between criminal enterprises and state actors whose objectives seemed to align with destabilizing American economic and security interests. The breakthrough had come during Sarah's third week of analysis, when she'd identified a pattern within the communication intercepts that had been dismissed by other analysts as routine criminal coordination. The timing of specific communications had correlated with major economic events and infrastructure incidents in ways that suggested advanced knowledge rather than opportunistic response. Sarah's analysis had indicated that what the federal task force had been investigating as criminal enterprise was actually a sophisticated intelligence operation using criminal networks as cover for activities that constituted direct threats to national security. Her findings had been so significant that Director Hamilton had convened an emergency session involving not just FBI leadership, but representatives from intelligence agencies whose names Sarah had only heard whispered in classified conversations. The briefing had required security protocols that exceeded anything she'd experienced during her federal training, with participants whose credentials suggested that Sarah's analytical work had attracted attention at the highest levels of the national security establishment. Agent Chen's analysis indicates that we're not dealing with traditional organized crime, Director Hamilton had explained to the assembled officials, his voice carrying the weight of implications that stretched far beyond routine federal investigation. The patterns she's identified suggest systematic intelligence operations using criminal networks as operational cover. This investigation now requires coordination at levels we hadn't anticipated when we began tracking the financial transactions. The transformation of the investigation from criminal matter to national security concern had represented validation of Sarah's analytical capabilities at the highest possible level. But the recognition had come with responsibilities that tested every skill Sarah had developed during her law enforcement career. The intelligence operation she'd identified had been so sophisticated that disrupting it would require international coordination involving agencies and governments whose cooperation couldn't be assumed. Sarah's continued analysis would be essential for understanding the full scope of the threat and developing response strategies that could neutralize the operation without triggering broader conflicts with the state actors who appeared to be coordinating the criminal networks. The pressure had been unlike anything Sarah had faced during her time as an FBI analyst, and the high-stakes scenario she'd uncovered had uncovered a new level of analytical competence, and Venera's unlimited database access had been invaluable.
Anything Sarah had experienced during her years of independent investigation in Chicago,
The pattern she was tracking had implications for international relations and national security, with analysis deadlines measured in days rather than months, and results that would inform decisions at the highest levels of government. Every connection she identified had to be documented with precision that would satisfy intelligence professionals whose standards exceeded anything she'd encountered in traditional law enforcement. Working with a team of analysts whose security clearances required background investigations that had taken months to complete, Sarah had been mapping an intelligence operation whose scope had grown more disturbing with each layer of analysis. The criminal networks had been infiltrating critical infrastructure with systematic precision, placing assets within energy companies, transportation systems, and communication networks in patterns that suggested long-term strategic objectives rather than immediate criminal profit. The communication intercepts had revealed coordination between criminal enterprises and foreign intelligence services that constituted clear threats to national security. Sarah's analysis had identified specific operations designed to compromise American economic stability and infrastructure resilience, with timeline coordination that suggested the criminal networks were receiving strategic direction from state actors whose objective aligned with weakening American influence and capabilities on the international stage. The most disturbing discovery had been the extent to which the criminal networks had succeeded in their infiltration efforts. Sarah's mapping had revealed asset placement within industries and institutions whose compromise could affect everything from energy distribution to financial markets to communication systems that supported critical government operations. The intelligence operation had been running for years, longer than anyone had suspected, with criminal networks serving as perfect cover for activities that traditional intelligence agencies would have found difficult to conduct without triggering counterintelligence responses. Sarah's analysis had also revealed the sophisticated methods the operation had been using to avoid detection by traditional intelligence and law enforcement agencies. The criminal activities had been carefully calibrated to appear as routine organized crime rather than coordinated intelligence operations, with financial transactions and communication patterns designed to trigger responses from agencies whose investigative approaches weren't equipped to recognize the national security implications of what they were tracking. The coordination between criminal enterprises and foreign intelligence services had been so sophisticated that it had taken Sarah's pattern recognition capabilities to identify connections that had been invisible to conventional analytical approaches. The financial flows had been designed to appear as money laundering rather than intelligence funding. The communication intercepts had been structured to sound like criminal coordination rather than operational planning, and the infrastructure infiltration had been implemented gradually enough to avoid triggering security assessments that might have revealed the true scope of what was happening. Working with intelligence professionals whose expertise complemented her pattern recognition capabilities, Sarah had been developing response strategies that could disrupt the operation without revealing the extent of American counterintelligence capabilities. The challenge had been designing interventions that would neutralize the threat while appearing to be routine law enforcement actions, rather than coordinated national security responses that might escalate tensions with the foreign governments who appeared to be directing the criminal networks. The complexity of the required response had tested every analytical skill Sarah had developed during her law enforcement career. The operation couldn't be disrupted without risking escalation, but it could be neutralized through a series of targeted interventions that would disrupt the operative capabilities of the criminal networks while appearing to be routine law enforcement actions. The success of this approach would require deep understanding of the patterns involved and precise execution to interrupt the operation without triggering the responses that would tear the fabric of international relations. The challenge was to intercept these delicate patterns and understand their strategic significance without compromising the rights and safety of individuals whose lives had been affected by the infiltration efforts. Sarah had been working on recognizing and intercepting complex patterns since she was a young principal investigator in Chicago, but this task required a level of analytical complexity and strategic foresight that took 20 years in 3 continents to identify connections that had been invisible to conventional analytical approaches. The pressure was high when 3 continents were going to war, but Sarah was determined to use her skills to identify the networks that could have put many people at risk and make the world more stable.
Through traditional arrests and prosecutions, because the criminal networks were just the visible layer of an intelligence operation whose true objectives and capabilities extended far beyond what criminal justice approaches could address. Sarah's analysis had to support response strategies that coordinated law enforcement actions with intelligence operations
whose existence couldn't be acknowledged publicly. The breakthrough that would change everything had come during Sarah's 5th week of analysis, when she'd identified a critical vulnerability in the intelligence operation that could be exploited without revealing American counterintelligence capabilities. The criminal networks had been using specific communication protocols that created exposure points where coordinated law enforcement actions could disrupt their operations while appearing to be routine investigations rather than targeted counterintelligence responses. Sarah's discovery had been that the foreign intelligence services directing the criminal networks had made a fundamental error in their operational security. Their need to maintain coordination across multiple criminal enterprises had required communication methods that created patterns detectable by the kind of analytical approaches Sarah had been developing throughout her law enforcement career. The sophistication of their operation had created complexity that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of pattern recognition that had attracted federal attention to Sarah's work in the first place. The vulnerability had been subtle enough that it had been invisible to conventional intelligence analysis, but clear enough that Sarah's pattern recognition had been able to identify specific points where coordinated disruption could neutralize the entire operation. The foreign intelligence services had been so focused on avoiding detection by traditional counterintelligence approaches that they'd created exposure to analytical methods they hadn't anticipated American law enforcement capabilities would include. Sarah's identification of the vulnerability had led to emergency planning sessions involving agencies whose coordination had required security protocols she'd never experienced during her federal training. The response strategy would involve simultaneous law enforcement actions across multiple countries, coordinated with precision that would test international cooperation capabilities while maintaining the appearance of routine criminal investigations rather than coordinated intelligence operations. The planning had required Sarah to work with intelligence professionals whose expertise in international operations complemented her analytical capabilities in ways that had expanded her understanding of how pattern recognition could support national security objectives. Her role had evolved from analyst to strategic coordinator, responsible for ensuring that the timing and execution of law enforcement actions would achieve maximum disruption of the intelligence operation while maintaining operational security that protected American counterintelligence capabilities. The final phase of planning had involved coordination with law enforcement agencies in allied countries whose cooperation was essential for the success of the operation. Sarah's analysis had been translated into actionable intelligence that could guide simultaneous raids and arrests across 6 countries with timing coordinated to prevent the foreign intelligence services from adapting their operations or relocating their assets before the full scope of the disruption could be implemented. The pressure during the final weeks of preparation had been unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her years of tracking organized crime patterns in Chicago. Every aspect of her analysis had been reviewed by intelligence professionals whose standards required precision that exceeded anything she had encountered in traditional law enforcement, with results that would inform actions affecting international relations and national security at the highest levels. Working with resources and support that had transformed
Analytical capabilities beyond anything she'd imagined possible during her years of independent investigation, Sarah had been mapping intelligence operations whose sophistication had required her to develop analytical approaches that pushed the boundaries of what pattern recognition could achieve when properly supported and resourced. The federal assignment had provided the professional environment where her capabilities could achieve their full potential in service of objectives that mattered at the highest levels of national importance. The morning of the coordinated operation had arrived with weather that seemed appropriate for actions that would test years of planning and analysis. Sarah had been positioned in the FBI command center, monitoring communication channels that would coordinate law enforcement actions across 6 countries, while maintaining the operational security that protected the intelligence methods and capabilities that had made the operation possible. Her role had been to provide real-time analytical support as the raids unfolded, ensuring that any unexpected developments could be addressed without compromising the overall success of the disruption.
The operation had begun before dawn, with simultaneous raids in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, London, Frankfurt, and Toronto, targeting criminal enterprises whose coordination had been mapped through months of Sarah's analytical work. The timing had been coordinated with precision that reflected the international cooperation required for actions that would disrupt intelligence operations while maintaining the appearance of routine law enforcement rather than coordinated counterintelligence responses. Sarah had watched from the command center as reports flowed in from each location, confirming arrests and seizures that represented the culmination of pattern recognition work that had begun with her unofficial investigation of jewelry store robberies years earlier in Chicago. The sophistication of the operation being disrupted had exceeded anything she'd imagined when she'd first started tracking connections that others had dismissed as coincidence. But the analytical approaches had remained fundamentally the same as those that had attracted federal attention to her capabilities in the first place. The raids had been successful beyond the most optimistic projections from the planning phase. The simultaneous actions had captured not just the criminal networks that had been providing operational cover, but key personnel from the foreign intelligence services who had been coordinating the operations from within the United States. Sarah's pattern recognition had identified exposure points that had allowed law enforcement to penetrate operational security that had protected the intelligence operation for years of successful infiltration and asset placement. The intelligence gathered during the raids had confirmed every aspect of Sarah's analysis while revealing additional layers of the operation that had been invisible even to her pattern recognition capabilities. The foreign intelligence services had been conducting systematic infiltration efforts that exceeded anything American counterintelligence agencies had suspected, with criminal networks providing cover for activities that had threatened critical infrastructure and economic stability on scales that had required immediate response at the highest levels of government. But the success of the operation had also revealed the extent to which Sarah's analytical capabilities had been essential for identifying and disrupting threats that had been invisible to conventional intelligence and law enforcement approaches. Her pattern recognition had detected connections that had eluded agencies whose resources and expertise had been specifically designed for counterintelligence operations, demonstrating capabilities that had attracted attention far beyond the FBI leadership that had originally recruited her for federal assignment. The debriefing sessions that followed the operation had involved officials whose security clearances and institutional affiliations suggested that Sarah's analytical work had implications extending far beyond the specific intelligence operation they'd just disrupted. Her pattern recognition capabilities had demonstrated potential for identifying threats and opportunities that traditional analytical approaches might miss, creating interest in applications that could support national security objectives across multiple agencies and operational contexts. Director Hamilton had explained the broader implications during a classified briefing that had required security protocols exceeding anything Sarah had experienced during her federal training. Agent Chen, your analytical work on this operation has demonstrated capabilities that have attracted attention at the highest levels of the intelligence community, he'd said, his voice carrying implications that had suggested opportunities and responsibilities that would test every skill she developed during her law enforcement career. We've received requests from agencies whose names I can't mention in this context, all interested in applications of your pattern recognition capabilities to challenges they haven't been able to solve using conventional approaches. The requests had represented opportunities that exceeded anything Sarah had imagined when she'd first accepted the federal assignment that had transformed her from Chicago detective to intelligence analyst. The success of the counterintelligence operation had demonstrated that her pattern recognition capabilities could support national security objectives at levels that required coordination between agencies whose existence was itself classified, with applications that could affect everything from economic security to strategic planning to threat assessment across multiple operational contexts. The choice had been both obvious and overwhelming. Sarah's analytical capabilities had found their proper context within the federal intelligence community, supported by resources and recognition that allowed her to achieve results that mattered at the highest levels of national importance.
The pattern she'd been tracking since her early days of investigating jewelry store robberies in Chicago had led to work that could affect international relations and national security, validating years of persistence in developing analytical approaches that others had dismissed as conspiracy theories. But the success had also meant that Sarah's work had attracted attention that would test her capabilities in contexts she'd never imagined during her years of independent investigation. The intelligence community had recognized potential in her pattern recognition that could support objectives extending far beyond traditional law enforcement, with assignments that would require her to develop analytical approaches for challenges that had never been attempted using the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that had become her professional signature. The transformation from Chicago detective, whose work had been dismissed by family and colleagues, to intelligence analyst, whose capabilities had attracted attention at the highest levels of the national security establishment, had been complete. But it had also been just the beginning of applications that would test the full potential of pattern recognition when properly understood and supported. Sarah's analytical journey had reached a level where her capabilities could affect outcomes that mattered at the scale of international relations and national security, providing professional vindication that exceeded anything she'd hoped for when she'd first started tracking patterns others couldn't see. The weeks following the coordinated international operation had brought Sarah recognition that extended far beyond anything she'd experienced during her law enforcement career. But they'd also brought challenges that tested her ability to navigate success at levels where professional achievement intersected with national security implications that affected international relations. The debriefing process had involved officials whose security clearances required background investigations extending back generations, with questions
About her analytical methods that had probed the boundaries between intuitive pattern recognition and systematic intelligence methodology. Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly, with calls from agencies whose existence she'd only recently learned about, each requesting consultation on cases that had stalled using conventional analytical approaches. The Central Intelligence Agency had been particularly interested in applications of her pattern recognition to economic intelligence, where traditional analytical methods had failed to identify connections between seemingly unrelated financial activities that might indicate foreign manipulation of American markets. The National Security Agency had requested briefings on how her analytical approaches might enhance signals intelligence analysis, where the volume of intercepted communications had overwhelmed conventional processing capabilities. But the most significant recognition had come from the White House itself, where the National Security Council had requested a classified briefing on the implications of Sarah's analytical work for understanding threats that might be invisible to traditional intelligence approaches. The request had required security protocols that exceeded anything in Sarah's previous experience, with background investigations that had examined every aspect of her personal and professional history to ensure that someone with access to her level of analytical insight could be trusted with information that affected national security at the highest levels. The White House briefing had been conducted in a secure conference room whose technology and security measures had suggested that Sarah's analytical work had attracted attention from officials whose responsibilities included protecting American interests at the global level. The National Security Advisor had listened to Sarah's explanation of her pattern recognition methods with the kind of attention that suggested implications extending far beyond the specific counterintelligence operation that had brought her capabilities to federal attention. Agent Chen, your analytical work has identified vulnerabilities in our traditional intelligence approaches that we need to address immediately, the National Security Advisor had explained, her voice carrying authority that had made even Director Hamilton defer to her assessment of the strategic implications. The patterns you identified in the recent operation had been invisible to our conventional analytical methods for years. We need to understand how your approaches can be integrated into our national security infrastructure to prevent similar blind spots in the future. The conversation had evolved into a strategic planning session that had tested Sarah's ability to articulate analytical methods she'd developed through years of intuitive practice rather than formal training. The officials had been particularly interested in understanding how her pattern recognition could be systematized and taught to other analysts, creating capabilities that could be distributed across multiple agencies rather than concentrated in a single individual whose availability might become a limiting factor in addressing time-sensitive threats. Sarah had found herself explaining analytical approaches she'd never formally documented, describing thought processes that had developed through years of tracking connections others had dismissed as coincidence. The challenge had been translating intuitive pattern recognition into systematic methodology that could be replicated by analysts whose training and experience had focused on conventional intelligence approaches, rather than the kind of holistic connection mapping that had become Sarah's professional signature. The result had been an offer that exceeded anything Sarah had imagined when she'd first accepted the federal assignment that had transformed her from Chicago detective to intelligence analyst. The National Security Council had requested that she develop a new analytical division focused on pattern recognition applications to threats that traditional intelligence approaches might be ill-equipped to address.
Methods might miss, with resources and authority that would allow her to recruit and train analysts whose capabilities could complement and extend her own analytical approaches. The assignment had represented professional recognition at the highest possible level, but it had also meant taking responsibility for developing analytical capabilities that could affect national security outcomes in contexts where failure might have consequences measured in lives lost and strategic advantages surrendered to adversaries whose sophisticated operations had been invisible to conventional intelligence approaches. Sarah's pattern recognition had become a national security asset whose protection and development required institutional support at levels that tested her ability to manage success that exceeded her original career aspirations. The process of building the new analytical division had required Sarah to work with recruitment specialists whose expertise in identifying candidates with unusual analytical capabilities had been essential for finding personnel who could be trained in pattern recognition approaches that couldn't be taught through conventional intelligence education. The psychological profiles they've been seeking had been specific enough that traditional recruitment methods had been inadequate for identifying candidates whose cognitive capabilities aligned with the requirements for developing advanced pattern recognition skills. Sarah had found herself interviewing candidates whose backgrounds had been as unconventional as her own path from Chicago detective to federal intelligence analyst. Mathematicians who'd been tracking economic patterns in academic research, computer scientists who'd been developing algorithms for detecting anomalies in large datasets, even artists whose visual pattern recognition had been applied to analyzing satellite imagery for intelligence applications that had attracted federal attention to their capabilities. The training program Sarah had developed had been unlike anything in the federal intelligence curriculum, combining systematic analytical methods with exercises designed to develop the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that had been essential for her success in identifying connections others had missed. The challenge had been creating educational approaches that could transfer capabilities that Sarah had developed through years of independent practice to analysts whose training and experience had been grounded in conventional intelligence methods. Working with educational specialists whose expertise in developing unconventional training programs had been essential for creating curriculum that could teach pattern recognition as systematic methodology rather than intuitive insight, Sarah had been building educational approaches that could produce analysts capable of identifying threats that traditional intelligence methods might miss. The program had been designed to complement existing intelligence capabilities rather than replace them, creating analytical resources that could address blind spots that had been revealed through Sarah's counterintelligence work. The first class of analysts trained in Sarah's pattern recognition methods had been deployed to ongoing investigations that had been stalled using conventional approaches, with results that had validated the decision to invest resources in developing systematic pattern recognition capabilities. Their analytical work had identified connections in terrorism investigations, economic intelligence cases, and counterintelligence operations that had been invisible to traditional analytical methods, demonstrating that Sarah's approaches could be successfully transferred to other analysts whose capabilities could extend the reach and effectiveness of her analytical innovations. But the success of the training program had also attracted attention from adversaries whose intelligence operations had been designed to exploit the limitations of conventional American analytical approaches. Sarah's counterintelligence work had revealed that foreign intelligence
services had been developing operational methods specifically designed to avoid detection by traditional American intelligence capabilities, creating vulnerabilities that pattern recognition approaches were uniquely qualified to address. The challenge had become developing analytical capabilities that could stay ahead of adversaries whose operational sophistication had been increasing in response to American intelligence successes. Sarah's pattern recognition methods had provided advantages in identifying threats that traditional approaches had missed, but those advantages would be temporary if adversaries could adapt their operations to avoid detection by pattern recognition approaches that became predictable through repeated application. Working with strategic planning specialists whose expertise in anticipating adversary adaptation had been essential for developing sustainable analytical advantages, Sarah had been creating methodological approaches that could evolve in response to changing threat environments. The goal had been building analytical capabilities that could maintain effectiveness even as adversaries modified their operations to avoid detection by American intelligence methods they'd learned to anticipate and counter. The complexity of maintaining analytical advantages in an environment where adversaries were actively working to understand and counter American intelligence capabilities had required Sarah to develop approaches that combined systematic methodology with creative innovation that could produce analytical insights that remained unpredictable even to adversaries who had studied American intelligence methods extensively. The challenge had been creating analytical approaches that could evolve faster than adversary adaptation while maintaining the systematic rigor required for supporting national security decisions. Sarah's work had attracted international attention from allied intelligence services whose cooperation had been essential for addressing threats that operated across national boundaries. The pattern recognition capabilities she developed had applications for understanding criminal and intelligence operations that affected multiple countries, requiring coordination between agencies whose analytical methods and institutional cultures had been developed independently but needed to work together to address sophisticated threats. The international cooperation had been facilitated through classified agreements that had allowed Sarah to work with intelligence analysts from allied countries whose pattern recognition challenges had been similar to those she'd encountered in American intelligence operations. The exchange of analytical methods and insights had been beneficial for all participating agencies, creating collaborative capabilities that had been more effective than any single country's intelligence resources could achieve independently. But the international cooperation had also revealed the extent to which sophisticated adversaries had been developing operations that exploited not just individual countries' intelligence limitations, but the coordination challenges between allied intelligence services whose analytical approaches and institutional procedures had created gaps that could be exploited by adversaries who understood how to operate in the spaces between allied capabilities. Sarah's pattern recognition work had been essential for identifying these coordination vulnerabilities and developing analytical approaches that could address threats operating in the gaps between allied intelligence capabilities. The challenge had been creating analytical methods that could function across different institutional cultures and procedural frameworks while maintaining the security and effectiveness required for addressing threats that specifically targeted coordination weaknesses. The success of the international analytical cooperation had led to requests for Sarah to establish pattern recognition capabilities within allied intelligence services, creating a network of analysts whose coordination could address threats that operated across international boundaries and affected multiple countries by identifying and countering common threats that threaten intelligence operations and national security interests in multiple countries by coordinating actions among agencies whose independent capabilities were insufficient for addressing sophisticated adversaries that operated across multiple countries and intelligence jurisdictions. The assignment had required Sarah to develop training programs that could function within different institutional contexts while maintaining the analytical effectiveness that had made her pattern recognition approaches valuable for addressing sophisticated threats. Working with international partners whose expertise in cross-cultural intelligence cooperation had been essential for developing sustainable analytical relationships, Sarah had been creating institutional frameworks that could support long-term collaboration on pattern recognition applications to threats that required coordinated international responses. The goal had been building analytical capabilities that could function effectively across national boundaries while respecting the institutional requirements and security concerns of participating intelligence services. The personal recognition that had accompanied Sarah's professional success had been gratifying in ways that exceeded the career advancement and institutional authority that had transformed her from Chicago detective to senior intelligence official. The phone call from her parents congratulating her on the presidential commendation for her counterintelligence work had been one of the most satisfying conversations of her adult life, representing acknowledgement that had taken years of persistent effort to achieve. "Sarah, we saw the news about the presidential award," her mother had said, her voice carrying pride and amazement that had been absent from years of family conversations about Sarah's career aspirations. "They said your analytical work prevented threats that could have affected national security. We had no idea your pattern recognition was contributing to protecting the country at that level." The recognition had been everything Sarah had hoped for during the years when her family had dismissed her analytical work as conspiracy theories that demonstrated unrealistic career ambitions. Her father's acknowledgement had been even more meaningful because of his scientific background and appreciation for analytical rigor that had made his previous dismissal of her work particularly frustrating. "Sarah, I owe you more than an apology for not understanding the sophistication of what you were doing," he'd said, his voice carrying the kind of professional respect that had been absent from previous family discussions of her investigative work. "Your pattern recognition represents analytical capabilities at a level I didn't realize was possible in law enforcement and intelligence work." The conversation had provided closure for years of family tension while also validating Sarah's persistence in developing analytical capabilities, despite skepticism from people whose opinions had mattered more than professional recognition during the early stages of her career. Her parents' journey from dismissive concern to proud recognition had paralleled the broader professional transformation that had taken her from local detective to senior intelligence official, whose capabilities had attracted attention at the highest levels of national security leadership. But the personal satisfaction had been matched by professional challenges that tested Sarah's ability to manage success at levels where individual achievement intersected with institutional responsibilities that affected national security outcomes. The analytical division she'd been asked to develop had been growing rapidly, with recruitment and training programs that required administrative capabilities she'd never needed during her years of independent investigation and analytical work. Managing a staff of analysts whose capabilities and institutional backgrounds had been as diverse as their analytical specializations had required Sarah to develop leadership skills that complemented her pattern recognition expertise. The challenge had been creating institutional culture that could support innovative analytical approaches while maintaining the security and accountability requirements that governed intelligence operations at the highest levels of national security.
Classification and sensitivity. The administrative responsibilities had been complicated by the need to protect the analytical methods and insights that had made Sarah's pattern recognition valuable for addressing national security threats. The techniques she developed couldn't be documented in conventional training materials because their effectiveness depended partly on their unpredictability to adversaries, who might adapt their operations if they understood how American intelligence capabilities had evolved to address their activities. Working with security specialists whose expertise in protecting sensitive capabilities had been essential for maintaining the effectiveness of Sarah's analytical approaches, she'd been developing training and operational procedures that could transfer pattern recognition skills while protecting the specific methods and insights that needed to remain classified to preserve their utility for ongoing intelligence operations. The balance between capability development and operational security had required institutional innovations that tested her ability to manage complex organizational challenges. The success of Sarah's analytical division had attracted requests from agencies whose intelligence requirements had extended beyond the counterintelligence and criminal investigations that had originally brought her capabilities to federal attention. The Department of Defense had been particularly interested in applications of pattern recognition to strategic intelligence, where traditional analytical approaches had been inadequate for understanding adversary capabilities and intentions that affected military planning and resource allocation decisions. The Central Intelligence Agency had requested consultation on economic intelligence operations, where pattern recognition could identify market manipulations and financial activities that indicated foreign intelligence operations targeting American economic interests.
The Department of Homeland Security had been interested in applications to infrastructure protection, where pattern recognition could identify vulnerabilities and threats that traditional security assessments might miss because they operated across multiple systems and jurisdictions. Each new application had required Sarah to adapt her analytical approaches to different operational contexts and institutional requirements, while maintaining the effectiveness that had made pattern recognition valuable for addressing sophisticated threats. The challenge had been scaling analytical capabilities that had been developed through individual practice to institutional applications that could support multiple agencies and operational priorities simultaneously. The complexity of managing analytical capabilities that affected national security outcomes across multiple agencies and operational contexts had tested every leadership skill Sarah had developed during her transition from individual investigator to senior intelligence official. The responsibility for developing and protecting analytical capabilities that could affect international relations and strategic outcomes had required institutional sophistication that exceeded anything in her previous law enforcement experience. But the professional challenges had been balanced by personal satisfaction that extended beyond career advancement, to include recognition that her analytical capabilities had found their proper institutional context and resource support. The pattern recognition that had begun with tracking jewelry store robberies in Chicago had evolved into analytical approaches that could address threats affecting national security at the highest levels, validating years of persistence in developing capabilities that others had dismissed as unrealistic aspirations. The transformation had been complete when Sarah had been invited to brief the President's Intelligence Advisory Board on the implications of pattern recognition for understanding threats that traditional intelligence approaches might miss. The briefing had represented recognition at the highest possible level of American government, with officials whose responsibilities
Included advising the president on intelligence matters that affected national security policy and international relations. The advisory board briefing had been conducted with security protocols that exceeded anything in Sarah's previous experience, with participants whose security clearances and institutional responsibilities had required background investigations that had examined every aspect of their personal and professional histories. The discussion had focused on strategic implications of pattern recognition for understanding threats that might be invisible to conventional intelligence approaches, with emphasis on applications that could affect long-term national security planning and resource allocation decisions. Sarah's presentation had been received with the kind of attention that had suggested her analytical work had implications extending far beyond the specific cases and operations that had brought her capabilities to federal attention. The advisory board had been particularly interested in understanding how pattern recognition approaches could be integrated into strategic intelligence planning to prevent the kind of analytical blind spots that had allowed sophisticated threats to operate undetected for extended periods. The questions had tested Sarah's ability to articulate the strategic implications of analytical approaches she'd developed through years of practical application rather than theoretical study. The officials had been interested in understanding not just what pattern recognition could accomplish, but how its capabilities could be protected and developed to maintain advantages over adversaries whose intelligence operations had been specifically designed to exploit limitations in American analytical capabilities. The result had been a strategic directive that had authorized expansion of pattern recognition capabilities across multiple intelligence agencies, with Sarah designated as senior coordinator for analytical approaches that could address threats operating in the gaps between traditional intelligence methods. The assignment had represented professional achievement at the highest possible level, with authority and resources that could affect national security outcomes across multiple operational contexts and international relationships. Standing in her new office overlooking the Potomac, with wall displays showing analytical operations that spanned multiple continents and affected international relations at the highest levels, Sarah had reflected on the journey that had transformed her from Chicago detective, whose work had been dismissed by family and colleagues, to senior intelligence official whose capabilities had attracted attention from the President's Advisory Board and national security leadership.
The path had been longer and more complex than anything she'd imagined when she'd first started tracking patterns others had dismissed as coincidence. Filled with challenges that had tested her confidence in analytical approaches that had never been formally validated until they'd proven essential for addressing threats that traditional intelligence methods couldn't detect. But every obstacle had been preparation for work that tested her capabilities at levels that mattered for national security outcomes and international relations. The phone call from her parents expressing pride in her appointment to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board had been the final validation Sarah had been seeking throughout her career. "We saw the announcement about your new position," her mother had said, her voice carrying admiration that had replaced years of gentle skepticism about Sarah's analytical ambitions. "We finally understand that your pattern recognition wasn't conspiracy theories. It was intelligence work at a level we never realized was possible." Her father's acknowledgement had been equally meaningful because of his scientific training and appreciation for analytical rigor that had made his previous dismissal particularly frustrating during the years when Sarah had been developing capabilities that lacked institutional recognition and support. "Sarah, your
Analytical work represents achievements that exceed anything I accomplished in my medical career," he'd said, his voice carrying respect that had been absent from previous family discussions of her investigative work. "We are proud of what you've built, and sorry it took us so long to understand the significance of what you were doing." The recognition had provided closure for years of family tension, while also validating the persistence Sarah had shown in developing analytical capabilities, despite skepticism from people whose opinions had mattered more than professional advancement during the early stages of her career. Her parents' transformation from dismissive concern to proud recognition had paralleled the broader institutional recognition that had taken her from local detective to senior intelligence official, whose work affected national security at the highest levels. But the personal satisfaction had been matched by professional responsibilities that would test her capabilities in contexts she'd never imagined during her years of independent investigation in Chicago. The analytical approaches she developed would be applied to threats that affected international relations and strategic outcomes, with implications that extended far beyond the criminal investigations that had originally attracted federal attention to her pattern recognition capabilities. The work ahead promised to be the most challenging and consequential of Sarah's career, involving analytical applications that would test the limits of pattern recognition while contributing to national security outcomes that affected American interests at the global level. Her capabilities had finally found their proper institutional context, supported by resources and authority that could achieve results affecting international relations and strategic planning at the highest levels of government responsibility. The journey from Chicago detective, whose analytical work had been dismissed as conspiracy theories, to senior intelligence official, whose capabilities had attracted presidential attention, represented more than career advancement. It was validation of analytical approaches that had required years of persistence to develop and institutional recognition to implement effectively, proving that pattern recognition, dismissed by others as delusion, could be systematic intelligence methodology when properly understood and supported at levels that mattered for national security outcomes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.